The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution emerged as the direct legislative consequences of the Civil War and its immediate aftermath. These measures abolished slavery, established birthright citizenship, and extended voting rights to black males without racial restriction. Their timing followed a clear sequence tied to the progression and conclusion of armed conflict. The 13th Amendment took shape during the war itself, with initial resolutions introduced in December 1863 and final passage secured in early 1865. The 14th and 15th Amendments arose entirely after the fighting ended, as congressional responses to Southern resistance and the need to secure political gains from victory. No pre-war planning or legislative committees addressed any of these amendments. The only constitutional proposal, labeled a 13th Amendment before the war, sought instead to protect slavery in the states permanently. The Civil War itself received no formal declaration from Congress and operated as the suppression of a domestic rebellion rather than a declared conflict between sovereign nations. Neither side negotiated surrender terms that mandated emancipation, citizenship, or suffrage. Union victory simply restored geographic unity, while congressional action imposed the constitutional transformations that followed. The amendments reflected the structural realities of postwar power, with Southern representation excluded or placed under military oversight. Republican majorities exercised decisive control. This advantage proved essential. In ordinary circumstances, the amendments would not have secured the required two-thirds majorities in Congress or ratification by 3/4 of the states. The process, therefore, depended on the decisive military outcome that left the South defeated and temporarily voiceless. White male legislators of European descent, elected primarily by northern constituencies in a relatively young republic, bore sole responsibility for drafting, debating, and ratifying these changes. They operated without external direction or hidden networks. Their decisions locked into the Constitution principles of sweeping scope and enduring effect. Once embedded, the amendments became nearly impossible to alter, shaping national life long after the original framers had passed from the scene. The absence of transitional mechanisms or limiting language amplified their impact. Immediate, unconditional freedom combined with citizenship and suffrage produced alterations to the social and political order without historical precedent in scale or speed. These developments illustrate the capacity of legislative majorities to impose permanent constitutional change when temporary conditions grant overwhelming advantage. The amendments stand as products of partisan calculation, moral conviction, and the raw power conferred by victory. Their consequences extended far beyond the immediate post-war era, embedding principles that reordered citizenship, voting, and federal authority for generations. The legislators who enacted them acted within the constitutional framework, yet exercised that framework at its most expansive limit. Their choices reflected both the ideological currents of their time and the practical opportunities created by the war's resolution. The resulting document has governed the nation ever since, its provisions resistant to reversal and its effects woven into every subsequent debate over rights and equality. The genesis of the amendments during and after the Civil War. The 13th Amendment originated in the final stages of active combat. Congressional resolutions appeared in December 1863, once Union victory appeared probable. The Senate Judiciary Committee merged proposals and reported a version that passed the Senate in April 1864. The House approved the joint resolution in January 1865 after sustained lobbying. Ratification by the states followed in December 1865. This measure constitutionalized the Wartime Emancipation Proclamation and abolished slavery nationwide except as punishment for crime. The 14th Amendment arose strictly after hostilities ceased. Congress formed the Joint Committee on Reconstruction in December 1865 to examine Southern conditions. The committee produced the amendment in June 1866. Both houses passed it that month, and ratification concluded in July 1868. The 15th Amendment followed in February 1869, with ratification completed in February 1870. These two amendments addressed citizenship, equal protection, and voting rights in response to black codes and Southern resistance once the war had ended. No evidence links any of the amendments to pre-war legislative planning or committee work. The conflict began with Southern secession after the 1860 election and the attack on Fort Sumter. Congress treated the events as rebellion rather than war between nations. The Union's stated objective remained preservation of the national Union. Southern secession aimed to protect the institution of slavery. Neither side negotiated or implied any post-war conditions concerning emancipation, citizenship, or suffrage. Military surrender at Appomattox and subsequent capitulations ended armed resistance without political stipulations. The amendments, therefore, represented congressional initiatives enabled by victory rather than terms imposed at surrender. The 13th Amendment moved forward, while fighting continued, yet the 14th and 15th belonged fully to the Reconstruction period. Their passage relied on the exclusion of Southern voices and the temporary dominance of Northern Republican majorities. The sequence demonstrates how military success created a narrow window for constitutional revision. Without the decisive defeat of Southern forces, the amendments could not have advanced. State legislatures in the South ratified the 13th under provisional governments, but rejected the 14th until military districts compelled new elections and new assemblies. The process illustrated the Constitution's amendment mechanism operating at its limit. Legislators seized the opportunity presented by victory to embed changes that ordinary peacetime politics would have blocked. The resulting provisions proved irreversible once the required majorities had acted. Their language remained broad and principled, avoiding detailed policy prescriptions and thereby ensuring longevity. The Civil War thus served as both catalyst and enabling condition for amendments that reshaped the Republic in ways unforeseen at the conflict's outset. Key legislators, networks, and religious influences, senators, and representatives from northern and border states supplied the decisive leadership. For the 13th Amendment, Senator Lyman Trumbull chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee and consolidated proposals. Representatives James Mitchell Ashley, James F. Wilson, and Senator John B. Henderson introduced early resolutions. These men belonged to Republican or Unionist circles with ties to anti-slavery, constitutionalism, and state-level reform networks. Their associations included party caucuses and abolitionist organizations that had opposed slavery's extension. For the 14th Amendment, Representative John A. Bingham drafted the core citizenship and equal protection language. Representative Thaddeus Stevens led House debate, while Senator Jacob M. Howard managed the Senate floor. Senator William Pitt Fessenden chaired the Joint Committee on Reconstruction. Senator William M. Stewart guided the 15th Amendment through the Senate Judiciary Committee. All operated within the Republican congressional network that dominated both houses after the 1866 elections. Religious conviction supplied a central ideological foundation. The legislators drew primarily from Protestant traditions shaped by the Second Great Awakening. Evangelical and Congregationalist influences framed slavery as a national sin incompatible with Christian equality and natural rights. This moral framework animated the push for immediate abolition and subsequent protections. Protestant reform networks had long supplied the ethical language that legislators translated into constitutional text. The amendments reflected the belief that government must align with universal principles of justice derived from religious and philosophical sources. No coordinated religious organization directed the process, yet the prevailing Protestant ethos permeated the debates and the final wording. Minority religious participation remained marginal. Jewish members of Congress numbered only 2 during the relevant sessions. Representative Leonard Myers, a Republican from Pennsylvania, aligned with his party on key votes but exercised no leadership role. Representative Meyer Strauss, a Democrat from the same state, opposed the 13th Amendment. Neither man participated in drafting or committee work. Individual Jewish abolitionists existed outside Congress, yet their efforts never intersected with the legislative networks that produced the amendments. No documented personal or professional connections linked Jewish figures to the principal sponsors. The amendments, therefore, emerged from the actions of white Protestant legislators exercising the authority vested in them by Northern electorates. Their networks remained domestic, partisan, and reform-oriented rather than external or ethnic. Ratification under military oversight and duress. Ratification unfolded through state legislatures operating under varying degrees of federal pressure. The 13th Amendment secured approval from provisional governments established by President Andrew Johnson. These civilian bodies acted without direct military supervision. Several southern states ratified as a condition of readmission, yet the process involved limited coercion. The 14th Amendment encountered uniform rejection by the original provisional legislatures in 1866. Congress responded with the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, which dissolved those governments and divided 10 southern states into 5 military districts. Union generals exercised broad authority over elections, constitutions, and civil order. New legislatures, chosen under black male suffrage and with many ex-Confederates temporarily excluded, then ratified the amendment. Contemporary observers described the mechanism as ratification at the point of the bayonet. The 15th Amendment passed under Reconstruction governments already restructured by the earlier acts. Military oversight had begun to recede, yet the requirement of ratification remained tied to full readmission. The military districts supplied the structural duress that secured compliance. Federal troops enforced order, supervised elections, and protected new voters from violence. No records indicate soldiers literally pointing weapons at individual legislators during ratification votes. The coercion operated at the institutional level through denial of self-government and congressional representation until compliance occurred. State assemblies functioned under the shadow of occupation and conditional restoration of authority. This environment ensured the necessary votes without open battlefield renewal. Southern exhaustion after 4 years of conflict, combined with the deterrent presence of federal forces, prevented organized resistance. The process therefore relied on the decisive military advantage gained by Northern victory rather than negotiation or mutual agreement. The amendments, once ratified, became embedded in the Constitution. Their language contained no clauses for gradual implementation, economic safeguards, or relocation incentives. The absence of such provisions reflected the legislators' determination to make the changes immediate and permanent. The military-backed ratification window closed once Southern states regained full representation. The amendments have governed national life ever since, their enforcement clauses granting Congress ongoing authority, yet leaving detailed policy to future legislation. The entire sequence illustrates how victory created conditions for constitutional revision that peacetime politics could not replicate. Motivations, psychological factors, and the unprecedented scope. Multiple motivations converged in the legislative process. Moral and religious convictions supplied the ethical core. Legislators viewed slavery as a violation of Christian equality and natural rights. This perspective framed the amendments as rectification of a national sin. Political calculation operated alongside moral rhetoric. Republicans sought a loyal Southern voting bloc to counter ex-Confederate Democrats and maintain national power. Financial incentives favored Northern industry through continued protectionist tariffs and railroad development. Revenge against the South for wartime losses added a punitive dimension. Psychological dynamics reinforced these impulses. Group polarization hardened sectional identities into moral absolutes. Escalation of commitment locked both sides into prolonged conflict once fighting began. Groupthink within the radical Republican faction insulated leaders from moderation. Moral superiority and natural law ideology justified sweeping action without transitional safeguards. The Civil War itself exhibited classic patterns of polarization and reactance. Southern perception of existential threat produced secession and defiance. Northern determination to preserve the Union evolved into active emancipation once military necessity aligned with moral purpose. Post-war exuberance after decisive victory produced legislative steamrolling. The radical faction exercised unchecked power within Congress, while Southern voices remained silenced. The result was a rapid sequence of amendments without historical parallel. No previous society had emancipated millions of enslaved people immediately, conferred birthright citizenship, and extended suffrage in consecutive constitutional strokes. Earlier emancipations in northern states and the British Empire incorporated apprenticeships, compensation, or phased implementation. The American approach offered unconditional freedom, followed by full legal equality. Black males received voting rights, while white women remained disenfranchised, creating a new hierarchy of political participation. The 14th Amendment placed former slaves on the same formal citizenship plane as white women and children, a status shift accomplished without prior equivalent rights. The absence of assimilation programs or relocation incentives compounded the experiment's radicalism. Legislators debated colonization, but abandoned it after practical failures and rejection by black leaders. The Freedmen's Bureau offered temporary relief, yet lacked permanence or scale. The amendments contained no stipulations for education, economic self-sufficiency, or cultural integration. Their broad language established principles rather than detailed policy. This simplicity ensured durability, yet left implementation to future generations. The legislators who enacted the measures acted within the constitutional framework, yet exercised authority at its extreme limit. Their decisions reflected the unique conditions of post-war dominance rather than universal precedent. The amendments have endured because they met the Article 5 threshold and because the power that produced them proved decisive. In conclusion, the Reconstruction amendments stand as enduring monuments to the capacity of legislative majorities to reshape a constitutional order when military victory grants temporary supremacy. White male legislators of European descent, operating in a young republic, translated wartime success into permanent provisions that abolished slavery, defined citizenship, and protected voting rights. They acted without external guidance and within the formal amendment process. Their choices reflected moral conviction, partisan strategy, and the structural advantages of Northern dominance after Southern defeat. The amendments could not have passed without the war's outcome and the exclusion of Southern representatives. Once ratified, they became fixed features of the constitutional landscape, resistant to reversal and generative of consequences that extended far beyond the 19th century. The process reveals how power concentrated in a victorious faction can embed principles of sweeping scope. The legislators seized the narrow window afforded by military success to impose changes that ordinary politics would have prevented. Their decisions carried civilizational weight because they altered fundamental relations of race, citizenship, and federal authority without transitional mechanisms or limiting clauses. The long-term effects have included both legal advancements and profound social disruptions that persist into the present. The amendments illustrate the risks and permanence of constitutional revision undertaken under conditions of duress and dominance. Their legacy remains woven into the nation's governing document, a direct product of the legislators who framed them and the victory that enabled their ratification. These measures continue to define the boundaries of American citizenship and equality. Their enactment demonstrates the Constitution's flexibility at moments of crisis and its rigidity thereafter. The white men who bore responsibility for their passage exercised the authority granted by their era and their electorates. Their actions locked the Republic into a path whose full implications unfolded across subsequent generations. The Reconstruction amendments, therefore, represent both the highest exercise of legislative power and a cautionary instance of irreversible constitutional engineering in the aftermath of civil conflict.